Alright, so this is Bike Psych, and this is my second go at this particular subject. That's the first time I've had that problem. I did it yesterday and it just, I don't know, it just sounded really confusing, and so I thought I'd do it again. So this is my one piece of allotted exercise. So we're living currently under government restrictions, but I am allowed to get out to do my one bit of exercise, so that's what this is. I've chosen to come on the road though because using the cycle paths, there's quite a lot of people around, so I thought I'd just use the roads. It's probably a bit less likely that I get in close proximity to anyone. So the subject of this Bike and Psych is one that I've been asked for by my daughter actually, which relates to the fact that there's been a spike in people watching certain types of films. There has been since the arrival of the pandemic, and those films are films like Contagious and Outbreak and things like that. So my daughter's question was, why do people want to watch those movies at this time? Because we normally think that films, television and so on is really about escapism. So why would you want to watch something that is kind of a bit too close to home really? And yet people do. Maybe you want to do that and have done that. I have to admit, we watched Warm Bodies, a spoof zombie movie when things first started to happen. So anyway, what's going on psychologically here? So first of all, I guess I have to say that this is not a field that I have much knowledge about. I'm very interested in film, as you know. I'm also interested in psychology, but in terms of the horror genre, if you like, if you want to call it horror, and why people do things at this sort of time, I don't know. So I did some research, and I have to say there's very little out there about this. So I did a proper search of the major databases for academic studies and papers, and I just came up dry, at least about the specific question around why people are watching pandemic movies during a pandemic. I guess it's a bit too specific. Right, I need to navigate this. So it seems that question is a bit too specific, so I'm going to have to widen the question, and then I'll kind of come back to it and see whether we can apply any principles there to it. So I suppose the first thing to say is that looking at the papers, and I'll put the links to the paper, or I'll put the references to the papers, I should say, on the YouTube channel. But I'll also put stuff up on the screen, so hopefully you should be seeing that now. So there was a paper that was all about horror, and I kept coming across that really as, I guess, the bigger genre of the pandemic movie. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about horror. I understand that a pandemic movie doesn't necessarily fit into that, but I'll explain why that is relevant in my view as we go. So it's quite an old, well, very ancient genre actually. He's letting me go, thank you very much. Thank you, DHL driver. So yeah, it is kind of relevant. So if you look at ancient stories, myths, there's a lot of talk about pestilence and plague. We only need to look at the 10 plagues of Egypt, and then you see some of those plagues were literally plagues, you know, the boils and the death of the firstborn. These things are generally considered to be, if it happened at all, it's some sort of interpretation by people of that age as to what was going on, you know, and so they attributed it to a god. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's stuff around monsters and plagues and stuff there, and of course the Greek gods, there's lots of plague. So this is a very well worn genre, if you like, and there seems to be some feeling, and there was a couple of newspaper articles or magazine articles, The Guardian has one and Vox has one, I'll put links to that, talking about this question actually, so I'm not the first to address it. And they interviewed a couple of psychologists, and there was talk there about trying to control things that are confusing and so on, so that could be part of it. And also the need for some people to sort of look at their fears, face their fears, if you like, as opposed to other people who prefer to kind of ignore them, or at least push them down. Anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of history around art and illness and kind of horror, if you like. Now, a lot of zombie films came up in my search, and at first glance you might think, well, A, what's zombies got to do with this, and B, it sounds a bit insensitive talking about that sort of genre when, you know, this is a serious situation. But I feel like I have to talk about it because it is part of the research and it is relevant. So a lot of zombie tropes really are seen as metaphors of illnesses and plagues. If you think about, even the modern ones are often quite explicitly about some sort of disease. So there's a kind of lot of that there. It's all tied up though with quite an interesting history of the zombie movie, which there's a few kind of coming together of different cultures here, but generally it's considered Haiti as a place where the idea of zombies kind of first materialised. So there's a bit of ancient belief system there, but it's also related to feelings of powerlessness. And of course it was at the time of the slave trade, and Haiti was very much at the epicentre of that. And in the stories that they would tell, these zombies were literally dead people who were brought back to animation, if you like. They were not necessarily brought back to life, but they were animated in order to carry out work for slave owners. So you can see there's a big factor of control there, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. So that's literature, and so how do we think about it psychologically? So I want to address it in a few different ways. Hopefully on Bike Psych you've seen that psychology is a very wide discipline, so I'm going to talk about it in a few different perspectives. And I'm going to start with the kind of psychotherapeutic or psychoanalytic school of Freud and Jung. And so Freud, his ideas were, he kind of partitioned the self, if you like, the mind, into three, and he talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is kind of the animalistic. Morning. So the id is the animalistic side of us, the primitive side of us, the side of us that is all about passion, is all about desire, but also about fear, and I suppose instinctive as well. So that's the id. The ego is the part of us that's kind of trying to make sense of that. in some respects, or control in a modern setting. So it's the logical, it's the planned, it's the thought through, it's that side of your thinking, and he called that the ego. The super ego, which doesn't really come into this discussion, but I'll just mention it, is the kind of parental voice, if you like. It's the voice of our parent that says that's not a good idea, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. So I guess sometimes it's the conscience, sometimes it's accusing us of something, sometimes it's, you know, yes, you do the right thing. So that's the super ego. So from a Freudian point of view, you could see watching pandemic movies or the horror as being a way for the id to kind of control, the ego to control the excesses of the id. It's a way for the id to impose some sort of order on disorder. So you could see it as this battle, this ongoing battle between our primitive fears and our more scientific, more rational approach. And so it's a way for us to wage that battle, and through film and TV we're able to kind of win that battle, hopefully, and find a rational way through. But of course that fear is always there, so the id never goes away, it's always present. So that's quite interesting. Jung was a student of Freud for a while, and so he adopted a lot of his ideas, but he developed them and changed them quite a bit. Probably a bit less weird, I guess, Jung in some respects. I keep threatening to talk about Freud and I keep slagging him off, but I haven't done that yet, so I will do at one point. But Jung talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that he introduced was this idea of the collective unconscious. So Freud talked about the unconscious, and of course that's where the id lives. But for Jung, we are born with a collective unconscious, we inherit a collective unconscious. And he actually pointed to art and literature and mythology as a evidence for this. And he made the point that in all cultures, and you can see this if you look at European, but Native American, Japanese, Asian, African, all of these cultures have myths that have the same sort of archetypes. And these archetypes are, if you like, characters that appear in art, like, you know, the mother figure, the father figure, the strong man figure, the wizard or the magical figure, the wise sage figure. These tropes, these archetypes appear over and over again. We also have very similar themes, you know, we have flood themes and, again, pestilence themes and so on throughout all of these mythologies. And so Jung thought this was an evidence that we, not only do we inherit physical characteristics, but we inherit a kind of unconscious collective knowledge that we then have straight away at our disposal to use and apply to the world. So that's quite a interesting idea. Of course, there's no scientific evidence for that. In fact, I don't think any scientists believe that, or even, you know, see it as a viable option. Of course, we do have instincts that are passed on. We don't really understand the mechanism for that, but animals, you know, seem to do things that are passed on. So my little doggy, for instance, when you give her a chew or something. She goes off to the corner of the room and it looks like she's trying to bury it with her nose or cover it with some imaginary soil or leaves or something. And of course it looks hilarious, but so there's some sort of behaviour that's programmed in there. Would you call that a collective unconscious? I don't think so. But anyway, it's kind of interesting. So that's the psychoanalytic side. That's all I'm going to talk about. That. I want to talk about the more scientific approaches now. And I think an important concept is one of attention that I want to talk about. So a lot of ways to explain behaviour is around attention. What do we give attention to? And then of course we have to interpret what we give attention to or make sense of it. But attention first. So when we're thinking about attention, it's important that we are able to give something attention. If you think about our evolutionary past, you know, we would need to attend to a rustle in the bushes or a figure because it could mean our life. We'd also have to attend to opportunities for feeding, mating and so on. So we have this ability to give attention to certain things, and so we're wired up to be very attentive, if you like. And there's been evidence that shows that once we kind of get hooked on something, once we have an interest in something, our attention to that really does spike. So we then seek out other opportunities for attention to the same sort of thing. So for instance, there's been studies, I think, I'll put the reference on if I can remember it, if I can find it, but there's been some research on pregnant women women who wanted to have a baby, who suddenly noticed pregnant women everywhere. And of course it doesn't just stop there, they obviously seek out information about pregnancy and having babies and so on. So there's a heightened awareness, heightened attention. So that's, I think, quite an interesting development there. And of course, with watching frightening movies around pandemics, that could be another example of that, really. So first of all, we notice the film, so that's part of, as any marketeer would know, part of being able to sell something. So first of all, we just notice that there's a film called that, whereas we might have ignored it before, but we suddenly want to seek out more of that because we are interested, we are attentive towards it. Staying on the scientific side of things, there is some evidence that there are individual differences, and I think we can see that from experience. You know, some people like to watch horror, some people don't. Some people want to watch pandemic movies during a pandemic, other people don't. And so I think that's kind of common sense, but it's also, there's some evidence of that from neuropsychological studies. I'm not a neuropsychologist, but the brain has a number of structures in it that are seen as centres, if you like, or at least mechanisms for things like fear. So the amygdala is often quoted, there's the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, the adrenal gland. These structures obviously regulate to some degree the chemicals, the endocrine system, and so you end up with things like adrenaline pumping around your body, cannons, so-called fight or flight response. So it's been demonstrated that there seems to be, and I think this is quite tentative, but there seems to be a relationship between general fearlessness and a propensity for watching horror movies. So if you tend to be a person who doesn't get scared easily, you might even be an extreme fearless person, if you like, a real thrill seeker, then you're more likely to want to watch horror movies. I don't know if that applies to pandemic movies, but it's it's worth looking into, I guess. So there is some individual differences there. So this piece of research, again, I'll put the reference on. It was actually a PhD thesis, dissertation. They did some neurological imaging and also some questionnaires, and kind of found a loose or a mildly significant relationship between fearlessness and the desire to watch horror. But I'm going to go back to this attention thing because I think that's kind of very relevant, and I want to use that in terms with, or in line with, a more social science, social psychology approach. So we mentioned that attention might be part of the reason why people are attracted to those sorts of movies, but we want to know why now, why at this time particularly. And so I think a social psychology approach is illuminating. So on my previous Bike Psychs, I talked about this idea of sense making. This term is used a lot in a method that I'm currently using in some research called interpretative phenomenological analysis, which basically means that you are trying to understand people's experience and interpret it through psychological theory. And one of the big phrases in that is this sense making. We are sense making machines. As soon as we see something, we don't just attend to it like a robot would attend to it, but we have to place it in some sort of context. We have to interpret it, we have to contextualize it. We might ask questions like, what is this an example of? We'll probably make decisions about what it is an example of. And so if we see something, we have to contextualize it, we have to make sense of it, we have to relate it to other things. So I would suggest that currently we're all finding it really difficult to do that. We're finding it really difficult to make sense of the sort of things we're hearing on TV, sort of images we're seeing on TV, and some of the ways we're feeling internally. And I think that's part of the struggle. So for me, watching things like that, and I guess by extension watching news programs and other things that are constantly talking about this one subject, I think that is an example of us trying to make sense of it. So I think we've all recognised that, forget pandemic movies for a moment, just watching the news, which if we want to we can watch pretty much 24 hours a day, that in itself is like watching a horror movie sometimes. And yet, if we're not careful, we could spend all of our time doing it. And many of us have made decisions to say, look, I need to know what's going on, I need to know what the latest advice is, but I can't sit and watch this all day because it will drive me mad. But I think what's happening there is this desire for us to make sense out of what we're seeing, make sense of what seems to be senselessness, and it's really about trying to put it into context. And that might be why we watch things like horror or pandemic movies, because we're trying to put this into some sort of context that we can make sense of, and this film is allowing us some way of making some sort of sense of it because we're seeing it in front of our eyes. The other final piece that I think is really interesting is references to somebody called Carol, and I'll put the references in again, but I think he really kind of nails it, to be honest, and says, well, why do we like horror? What is going on? And he makes the point that there's a kind of paradox around horror, and that is that what we're seeing in horror, and I would argue in pandemic movies as well, is an anomaly. It's something that, again, we can't make sense out of. It doesn't fit our normal experience. Therefore, we find it frightening, we find it anomalous. So, as an anomaly, we're frightened by it, we're even repulsed by it. But on the other hand, because of that attention thing, we're also attracted to it. We need to be. So we're attracted to the anomalous, but we're also repulsed by it. And I think we end up in a kind of loop. And it's this kind of paradox that sometimes can make something horrible, something that we really don't want to see, so compelling that we can't take our eyes off it. Like an accident that we don't want to look at what's happened, but we seem to not be able to take our eyes off it, and or a news item. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. So it's the mixture of this attention bias, or this need to find attention, or this need to attend to things, I should say, which is evolutionarily adaptive, but also this repulsive feelings towards something that makes us afraid and frightened. At the same time, we've got this desire to make sense out of what we're experiencing, and so we might watch something like that to help us to do that. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not an expert in this area, but that's my interpretation of what's happening. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that. So please engage with me and talk to me about what you think is going on. And you might think I've got it completely wrong, you might be an expert in one of these areas, so by all means put your thoughts forward. But anyway, that's it for today. I suppose the last thing I want to say is thank you for listening. It's not an easy subject to talk about, but I wanted to talk about it. I was asked to talk about it, so I hope it was useful. Please subscribe if you are interested in these sorts of videos. Please subscribe to the Evil Sheep channel. Thank you again.